A high wall with a big gate and a smart gate. Wait for it. The New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman. It seems Mr. Friedman was able to go down to, I believe it's pronounced San Ysidro or something like that.
San Ysidro, yes.
Yes. And he got a chance to spend some time with some Border Patrol people and to tour what passes for a wall down there, or the beginnings of a wall down there. And he has some interesting notions about that. Now, in general, it's a column in the New York Times criticizing President Trump for not taking advantage of the current crisis to do something that he really could do to solve this border issue. But basically, Friedman seems alarmed to learn that since last year, family unit apprehensions at the border have gone up 374%, from about 40,000 family units, that means at least one adult and one child, up to 190,000. In addition, individuals coming across the border have jumped tremendously. A couple of years ago, about 1% of people coming across the border were claiming asylum. Now it's about 30%. Bill, we have trouble here because Thomas Friedman is not exactly the darling of the right, but here he is basically calling for what President Trump's been calling for. I hesitate to name this, but I'm going to call it, for your purposes, Friedman Gate.
I can just see Thomas Friedman down there in San Ysidro sitting around a campfire with two Border Patrol officers and having a chance to liquor up a little bit. He begins to explain to the Border Patrol officers why this whole border idea is a terrible idea. And they ask him, where did you get your ideas on the border? And he says, New York City. And they go, New York City? Pretty much the same thing with the border security as it is with Chile, right? Those are great ads. And what I mean by that is, this is yet another example, although I have to say, to give credit where credit is due, it is an example of somebody apparently waking up and changing their mind. But one of the reasons that we do the work that we do here is not because we disagree with people because it's their opinion or our opinion. They like magenta and we like cyan. It's not that at all. It's that there is an on-the-ground reality that does exist. And the on-the-ground reality that exists is a long, 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 long way from the skyscrapers of Manhattan. And I mean not just geographically a long way. I mean culturally, it's much further away
Bill,
than it is
you're not helping my
geographically.
cause here, because the main reason I did this episode was to prove to people once and for all that conservatives oppose progressives just to be obstinate. It's just that they hate the progressives and they don't want to be ever seen agreeing with them. Isn't that the case?
Oh, you're right. So the New York Times, I got you. So the New York Times says we need a wall. Well, I say to hell with that. We don't need a wall. What we need is to flatten the border and they let the damn New York Times tell us what to do. There is a real. We've talked about the border so many times. I don't think the actual border is the issue here, or even the wall. There is a real sense of hope that I get when people who are adamantly on one side of the argument get to experience, or their side of the argument, get to experience our side of the argument. It's the same thing you see when you first take people shooting, or a much better example. I remember when Black Lives Matter movement started, that one of the city police departments offered to take one or two of these Black Lives Matter activists not only on a drive around, but also put them through the kind of training where they have an actual pistol with blanks, and they have a split second to make a decision on whether somebody lives or dies. And pretty much uniformly, the people who had been so ardently against the police and how they behave in the field came back pretty chastened with the sense of, I just hadn't realized that because it's one thing to say, well, the officer was under strain and so he fired, and well, I wouldn't have done that. Well, yeah, you would have. And when you put people into the situation where they're actually talking about, rather where they know what they're talking about because for the first time ever they're actually experiencing what they're talking about, you often get this kind of epiphany. And this is, I'm not entirely sure that this is a two-way street. I think the real reason that so many times progressives will experience the reality on the ground and have an awakening is because we deal with real world issues. And one of my favorite expressions ever about progressives and liberalism is to say, well, yeah, sure, it works in practice, but will it work in theory? And I think that's really the root of this issue.
Well, Bill, let me give you a little bit of Thomas Friedman's narrative here that illustrates what you just said. And this is quoting from the New York Times column. The areas around San Ysidro that were most actively used by migrants before a real border barrier was installed were zones of disorder where residents and had foreigners passing through their yards every night, some transporting drugs. Where there is now a proper fence and crossing the border illegally is virtually impossible, you see shopping centers, schools, and new housing. Indeed, when we went out to the end of the new wall, if you peeked around the other side, you could see that the Mexican homeowner on the other side had planted trees and created a patio right next to the wall because he knew his backyard would no longer be used as a launching pad for human smuggling gangs.
Imagine my surprise. Imagine my surprise. Now, I have to say that is an angle that I had never, ever considered before. And it's a very, very important angle, especially given how the fight is always couched in emotional terms rather than rational or logical terms, because that's how children argue. But that's what we're dealing with. The idea that a border wall would protect Mexicans is a fantastic breakthrough idea that I'd never had before. Of course it makes sense. If you've got guys, you just go to the internet, you'll see hundreds of them, night vision photos of Mexican drug runners with AK-47s miles into American territory. The thought just never occurred to me before, to be perfectly frank with you, Scott. I've been so busy concentrating on what they do to Americans who live on the border. It never occurred to me, but the obvious fact that's staring us all right in the face is these guys have to be someplace when they cross the border, and they're on the property of, generally speaking, law-abiding Mexican families, and they're as terrified and as frustrated as the people on our side of the border. And this is all I would ask, of the open border people. I would just say, listen, here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to have you rent this house on the border for a week and don't lock the doors.
Bill, I can't help but think that a bunch of progressives woke up this morning and unwrapped their copy of the New York Times and said to themselves, they got Friedman. I mean, Friedman actually goes into detail describing this process that the mules use. Is that the term? What's the coyote is the word I'm looking for. A different animal. The coyotes use. Basically, what they'll do is they will bring some families to the border who will immediately surrender to Border Patrol agents and ask for asylum. Those people will quickly overwhelm the capacity of the local Border Patrol to be able to handle their numbers. Meanwhile, down the road a little bit, the illegal people start coming across, in the sense that people who are running drugs or people who were kicked out of the United States of America and are trying to get back into it. And so basically, they use that pressure point to overwhelm local resources, and then they rush across the border. What he describes here is exactly the kind of thing that President Trump has been talking about. How do you think that progressives in general are going to react to the idea that Friedman seems to be, and I'll get into more of that later, seems to be endorsing what President Trump has called for since June 2015?
And the angel of death swept low over Berkeley and Santa Monica, and countless subscriptions were canceled in that bloody evening. Yeah, I mean, it will affect some people, but the thing about this progressive mindset is it's virtually impenetrable from a rational point of view. The only way you can defeat progressivism is to defeat it emotionally, which means morally, which is not so hard for us because we generally tend to be on the morally correct side of things. So what I mean by that is there's any number of progressives who are completely against any kind of school vouchers or choice, but they send their kids to private schools. They say they want higher taxes, but they tell their accountants to take every deduction possible. They say that that no one should be able to own a gun, but when things like the riots erupted here in Los Angeles, all of them are calling their conservative friends to get a gun. And students say that they're socialists, but if you ask them to sell their cell phones and distribute the money to the poor, they won't do it. The entire belief system is predicated on a series of assumptions of how they would behave that have no connection to reality. And while this may sound like a divergence, it's not. It's because this really does actually represent the mindset. This actually happened to me. I was I was at the house of the parents of a woman I was dating many, many years ago, and the mother was a very big liberal, very forceful woman, and we got into an argument about guns, and she ended up saying that she would rather have her daughter be killed than have her own a gun and defend herself successfully. She said that out loud. She said that in front of the daughter. At which point I just simply said, no, that's just, you don't believe that. I know you think you believe it, and I know you believe it now. I know you're sitting here in this incredibly expensive house in Orange County with multi-millions of dollars of art all around, but I don't believe you. I believe you believe it now, but if you were standing there and watching your daughter being assaulted and raped, and she had a gun and the means to defend herself, you would not say, no, let her die for the cause. You just wouldn't. It's just a lie. So let's just cut to the chase here. And this is what we see again and again and again. So you can go at people with rational arguments. As far as the wall goes, you hear constantly, walls are not effective. Well, ask the Israelis if walls are effective. They were getting daily terror attacks, daily, and then they put up a wall. And now they don't get none. And that argument doesn't work with progressives, because progressives see the Mexicans and the Palestinians in these two examples as underdogs, which means they're victims. And if they're victims, that means they are morally correct. And if they're morally correct, that means they're ideologically supported. So the rational argument doesn't work. But what does work is to say, listen, what do you hate so much about these Mexican families on the Mexican side of the border who are being terrorized by these drug running gangs and who are now protected because the wall that went up, they have no desire to illegally come to the country. They would just like to have a nice house with a nice yard. They're planting trees now because the criminals coming from Mexico are no longer coming into the United States. They have to cross both of our yards, What is it against these simple Mexican people who live on the border that you hate so much? Why are you so constantly saying things in skyscrapers in New York and San Francisco to deprive these poor Mexican campesinos of the chance to put flowers in their gardens? That kind of thing has an effect on them. And
now, lest we think that Thomas Friedman's now wearing a "Make America Great Again" cap, the purpose of the column, ostensibly, at least this is how he got it past his editors at the New York Times, and why his readers won't be completely lost, is that President Trump is allowing a crisis to go to waste. And here's the paragraph, the money quote from Thomas Friedman. Unfortunately, all those actions, meaning the actions he recommends taking, and I'll go through those in a second, all those actions would require a president ready and able to forge a national immigration compromise. Instead, we're stuck with a man who just exploits the border crisis and uses his wall to divide the nation and energize his base. And by the way, here's what Friedman is calling for, Bill. He wants us to invest money to help stabilize other countries, or continue to do that and do it more so, to do things to mitigate climate change. He wants us to celebrate high IQ, high energy immigrants. That's the phrase he uses, high IQ, high energy immigrants. He wants us to embrace the true asylum seekers, but he acknowledges that many are taking advantage of our open heart and open hand to claim to be asylum seekers who are really just economic migrants. And he also wants us to expand the capacity of immigration courts so it doesn't take 2 to 3 years for your case to get through the courts. When you hear that kind of list, do you think that there's a basis for President Trump to sit down with Nancy Pelosi and forge some sort of a compromise?
Well, there's certainly a basis for him to sit down with Friedman. There would be a basis for him to sit down with Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi if we did what I'd suggested earlier and simply rented a piece of property directly on the border, made them live there for 1 week, not without electricity or food or anything, just live there for 1 week, spend 7 nights there, and for God's sake, whatever you do, don't lock your doors. That would be the end of their argument too. As far as this litany of things that he just pronounced, what he's basically saying, if I understand him correctly, is that this wall is necessary, it's an immediate threat, and it's a potent threat. We need to get on it right away. And Donald Trump is dividing America by saying that we need a wall and we need to get on it right away. That's essentially what he's saying here.
Well, he's saying that Trump could use the wall as the impetus to do some things that Friedman thinks really need to be done. But
hold it right there.
But he's
hold
agreeing
it right
with
there.
Trump.
Hold it right there. what Friedman is saying in the New York Times is that Donald Trump could use better social techniques or whatever in order to forge a coalition to agree on what needs to be done. And Friedman himself agrees that what needs to be done is that a wall needs to be built. But Friedman did not have that opinion prior to going down there to see the wall, to see the border. He didn't have that opinion. As a matter of fact, although I don't know this for a certain fact, if he's a columnist from New York in the New York Times, then most certainly he spent a serious amount of time criticizing the entire idea of a border and a wall. And so to say that it's Donald Trump's fault for not being more glad-handing about a problem that actually exists, that Donald Trump knows exists, that the American people know exists, and that virtually the only people that don't know exist are people in skyscrapers in New York, for him to come out and say that it's Trump's fault for not being nice enough about it is a pretty big reach for a guy who works for a newspaper whose entire purpose is to make sure that its readers never learn the truth of what's going on at the border. If the New York Times were to be, I don't know, what's the word I'm looking for? It's an archaic word. A newspaper. Newspaper. Then before they started making these editorial comments about walls and stuff, they would send teams of reporters down there. I know this is a wild and crazy loony idea, but just hear me out. They would send unbiased people down there to ask questions, to get into the situation, put themselves in other people's shoes, and get a realistic view of what is actually happening before they formed their opinions and tried to influence the rest of the American people in their direction. But that is not only not what they do, it's the antithesis of what they do. They do not send reporters. As a matter of fact, any reports that come back through any kind of credible means, they immediately suppress. So you've got a guy here with enough firepower, enough clout to get this article into the New York Times, for which he will soon discover just exactly how tolerant the left that he defends really is. But again, what has happened here is a guy who was formerly against the wall, went to the border, now he's for the wall. And the reason that he got it in the New York Times at all is because he managed to make it look like it's Donald Trump's fault that the wall is not being built.
Well, we, of course, follow Sun Tzu's imprecation, or at least I've heard it attributed to Sun Tzu, that you should build your enemy a golden bridge across which to retreat. So let me finish up with this, Bill. And I've intentionally stretched this long because I think it's a fascinating topic. But this is what Thomas Friedman says. We're not going to get that done politically without the wall because people won't have confidence that we can control it. And Friedman says, we can't let everybody in.
So what he's saying is, we need to put up a wall because illegal immigration is cheating and it's depriving the actual immigrants who want to come to this country legally of their ability to come, because the illegal immigration is creating so much of a sense of hostility, rightfully so, according to his own analysis, that it's going to hurt immigration from other countries. Well, welcome to the conservative movement. And I, for one, would love to tell you that there's an entire long litany of things that you have to believe in order to be a conservative. There isn't. You have to believe in looking for the truth, that the truth really exists, and you have to love the country. That's pretty much it, I think. If you stick to the first one, you'll end up at the second one. And so what he's saying is what we've been saying for 10 years now, which is the direct refute to this slander that Republicans are anti-immigration. We're not anti-immigration. We're anti-illegal immigration. And we're anti-illegal immigration because it hurts actual immigrants. I'm not speaking for every conservative, but I'm speaking for pretty much every conservative that I know when I say that watching a room full of people from around the world raising their hands and swearing to defend the Constitution of the United States, and then that ceremony is over, and they're as American as a guy whose family came over on the Mayflower, that is such a beautiful moment for me. It just brings me to tears. They're just Americans who just happen to be born overseas. And so, yes, Mr. Friedman, correct. Yes, we need a wall. Yes, we need a wall to protect American citizens. Yes, illegal immigration is turning Americans against the entire idea of immigration. Yes, we absolutely need those, what are the H-1B visas for the basically for engineers and doctors to be able to reside here. And yes, we have plenty of room in this country, Scott. It's not that we don't have room. It's that we don't have room for this kind of open border terrorizing of the American public, of the gangs, of the people that are killed by these illegal immigrants. And now, forever in my quiver, I can add, we also don't have much tolerance for the fact that Mexican landowners on the border are suffering as much as American landowners are, because the Mexican government, shocking though this may be to some ears, apparently has got just a little bit of corruption in it, and is allowing. We talk about stopping armed groups of men crossing into the United States with AK-47s. We talk about putting a wall to stop that, but they're not coming in they're not parachuting in, They're coming across territory, and they live on that territory, and that territory is called Mexico. So this is really Mexico's problem. Now it's both our problems. I'm willing to settle for the fact that it's both of our problems. That's fine. But this is not only a win for thinking people and a win for the wall. This is a win for all of you out there who've been told by people like the writers at the New York Times that you're insane, that you're racist, that you're just a rotten, mean-spirited, ignorant, stupid person who hates everybody who's not white. When somebody like this goes to the border, comes to the same conclusions that you and I came to the minute we started to look into this seriously, it tells us that we are not what the progressive left makes us out to be, and that the actual racists, and idiots for that matter, are the ones who arrive in glass skyscrapers on the 80th floor to have their fourth, gin and tonic for the evening.
Looking for truth and loving this land of liberty and welcoming open-minded seekers after truth. 5 days a week, Bill Whittle now brings you Bill's analysis of the breaking news of the day. We're grateful to the people who have made that possible, a group of truth seekers who put their money where their seeking is by becoming members at BillWhittle.com. You can just go to that website, BillWhittle.com, click the Become a Member link, and you will open up a little gift of joy, I think, as you find an atmosphere for reasoned thought and vigorous inquiry and a fellowship of mutual encouragement. We hope you do that today. For the members at BillWhittle.com, we say thank you. I'm Scott Ott. This is Bill Whittle. Thanks for watching.